Hello, I am coming to you from lockdown here in my home in Connecticut in the United States. I hope that you and your family are all safe and sound back in Spain. And today I'm going to be presenting on youth protests and the end of the Zapatero government. This is chapter 8 in the text. So let's begin. First, I just want to take you through an agenda of what this presentation is going to cover. I'm going to discuss the beginnings of the 15M movement, the 15M movement. I'm going to discuss its spread from May through October. I'm going to discuss who the protests consisted of and what their core issues were. And I'm also going to evaluate the effect that it had on politics in Spain and the legacy that it left behind. So let's begin. So with the beginnings, how did this movement come to be? I think it's important to first discuss how Spain under Zapatero. So when Zapatero came into power in 2004, he presented himself as an innovator, progressive, seeking to present a new European left. His first mandate was largely successful from 2004 through 2008. He transformed Spain into a leading country for the recognition of citizens' rights. However, his second mandate from 2008 through 2011 is inextricably linked to the economic crisis that the country faced. This came as a result of the implosion of the construction boom and the millions of jobs that were lost as consequence of that. And this resulted in a decline of Zapatero's internal and external credibility as a politician. So he saw a significant amount of youth opposition in his second mandate. This all came about within the context of the economic crisis that the country was facing. And the peak year for these protests was 2011, which was also an election year in the country. What you saw through this youth mobilization was city squares across Spain being occupied, and the movement came to be known as the 15M, 15M, or Los Indignados, the indignant in English. So the movement really begins on Sunday, May 15th, 2011. And what happened on this day was that there were a popular demonstration taking place simultaneously in 60 different Spanish town squares that was all organized by a group of associations calling themselves Democracia Real Ya, Real Democracy Now in English. And the protests on this day were a huge success. And following the protests that took place in Puerto del Sol in Madrid, there was a spontaneous sit-in that was staged in Plaza de Callao. And when police attempted to clear the sit-in the next day, it resulted in clashes, which were seen on the news by many people in Spain. Meanwhile, you had this taking place simultaneously in cities like Barcelona, where you saw the hashtag Acampada BCN trending on social media with the sit-ins that took place in Plaza Catalunya. And you had similar events taking place across Spain in Malaga, Granada, Sevilla, Bilbao, and Zaragoza, just to name a few cities. So following this day, the movement begins to spread. You have more spontaneous assemblies taking place in Madrid the following Monday. And then when the police come to break up the sit-ins Tuesday morning, the protesters in Madrid surrendered. However, what they were really doing was using their cell phones and the internet to plan another demonstration in Puerto del Sol that same evening. And the demonstration comes together that evening in Madrid and is successful, and another acampada, another camp, is set up there. And camps begin to emerge across all cities in Spain, and they're all organizing for the first time ever through social networking, through the internet, through cell phones. The Puerto del Sol assembly attracted over 12,000 people in the evening, filling up the square. And by May 17th, just 2 days after the movement had begun, you have 30 acampadas set up across Spain. And the international press begins to take notice, and they begin to report on a so-called Spanish Revolution taking place. And the mobilizations continue after that. On May 18th, there were 52 acampadas set up across different localities in Spain. The election board in Madrid, following this, declared a ban on demonstrations, considering that they were about to have elections take place in a few days. But this ban merely bolstered the number of people occupying squares across the country. And 100,000 people came together to sign a petition to declare the ban on demonstrations null and void. So Spain right now is witnessing an unprecedented wave of participation in protests that they've never seen before in their history. And on May 27th, in Barcelona, police were seen using brute force to clear protests in Plaza Catalunya. Continuing into the summer, the protests become more spread out in Madrid. They move to different locations, not just centered on one square. On June 19th, 2011, there were 15 million protesters come together in 60 cities across Europe. And then following that, a month later in July, the beginnings of the Popular Indignant March, which brought protesters from squares all across Spain together to meet at the end of July, July 23rd through the 26th, for a big rally in Puerta del Sol. And at that rally, they came together and made plans for fall mobilizations to take place. And they decided that they would have a massive mobilization be done on October 15th. And on that day, an estimated 600,000 people in Madrid and 400,000 people in Barcelona took to the streets to protest. So this was obviously a very large movement that was noteworthy just for the sheer size of the people protesting. But let's dive a little bit deeper into what exactly they were protesting about. So it's important to first take a look at who was actually taking part in these protests, what types of people. It's really impossible to provide an exhaustive list just because there were so many different groups that were represented through the 15M protests. However, what's notable is just the huge amount of young people that were involved in the protests. There, you have a large number of protesters coming together without really like a clear leftist activist identity that they're all trying to follow. So, however, what they noticed was that almost all the youth protesters that were involved, which was the majority, were all out of school. They were post-adolescence. They were all highly educated. Most of these protesters had college degrees, and they were mostly middle class. This was mostly a middle class movement. And the reason why this age group was very notable was two reasons. There was a high degree of unemployment among them and a high degree of them still living at home with their parents, not living on their own despite having finished college. So they were known as the neither nor generation in English, or the ni generation in Spanish. And they were called that because they felt forgotten. They felt like the only real prospects, despite having real job prospects, despite having a high education, were a low salary and precarious, unstable job. So they were really coming together to voice their opposition with the current status quo and the opportunities that they were afforded. So what were they exactly asking for? Like I said, there were many different groups of people, many different interests and identities represented in this movement. But the bottom line was that all of them were really demanding a change to occur. They didn't feel represented by the current political paradigm that was in place. So their demands are indisputably linked to the economic crisis and the high levels of unemployment that the country was facing at the time. So they were essentially trying to raise concerns over the unstable employment that they were facing, the debt pressures that they had, the tightening of credit, the inability to borrow money, and cuts to the government's welfare programs as well. They were also coming together to protest the existing political class, which they felt left out of, the two-party dominant system that they felt didn't really provide a space for them in politics, and all the electoral laws that were in place in Spain that favored this system and the continuation of this system. Another thing that they tried to bring attention to through the protests was the widespread corruption in the political system in Spain. So now we're going to look into sort of the effects. Did this movement really precipitate into any form of change in Spain? So here I have a map of the outcome of the 2011 Spanish general election, which took place that November 2011, after all the protests from May through October had taken place. What you see is a huge victory by the opposition party, the People's Party, the PP, over Zapatero's PSOE, the Spanish Socialist Party. And you also see some small victories for some smaller third-party campaigns as well. So did the protest movement really have any influence on Zapatero's downfall? So the CIS, or the Centro de Investigaciones Sociológicas, said that the influence on the vote in the general election was not significant. They said that the 15M protests mainly affected minor parties. According to a survey by the organization, 25% of voters reported that they were influenced by the 15M demonstrations. A study done by Fundación Alternativas said that the elections of 2011 saw the biggest increase in blank and null votes since 1987. So what they interpreted from that was that this movement had a direct effect on the number of protest votes that were cast in the general election. Both of these groups noted that it's pretty much impossible, given just the wide range of ideologies that are represented in the protests, to sort of identify a single political ideology or position that came about from this movement and its effects on the elections. They said that ultimately it's Zapatero's handling of the economic crisis seems to be what's more responsible for his 2011 loss than any sort of protests that came about because of this. What this youth movement ultimately showed was the indifference to the 2011 elections. So when we're talking about trying to put some numbers behind the actual effect of the protests, it still does seem a little bit negligible to try to quantify it. When you look at, although there was a huge rise in the number of protest votes, there was barely a noticeable growth of blank votes, and the number of null votes essentially doubled, which are, if you look at the numbers, 165,000 to 317 are still small amounts relative to the total amounts of votes cast in the Spanish election. One thing that is actually significant is the drop in turnout. It declined by 1.4 million people who decided just not to participate in the election this time around, representing sort of the indifference to the general election. In terms of parties, the Spanish Socialist Party, PSOE, lost about 4 million votes, so definitely not good, while their opposition, the PP, gained about 600,000. And some of the other parties, the IU, the communist, the left-wing party, gained about 700,000 votes, which was a 70% increase from the last general election. And on top was the UPD party, which gained a total of 800,000 votes. So they definitely benefited the most in the 2011 general election from the protests. However, ultimately, it seems that they really didn't change the outcome just because of how bad the economy was doing under Zapatero. It seemed logical that his opposition, that the opposition party would win. So now I'm just going to briefly touch on like the legacy and the aftermath of the movement. So after Zapatero's defeat, I think what people see in the 15M, the 15M movement, is that it just sort of like served to highlight the predictable downfall of Zapatero and the PSOE government. You saw just a huge confidence drop among traditional voters for the PSOE, and as a result, they clearly rejected them and decided to vote for other parties. You saw that they lost 4 million votes in that election. However, after the socialists lost, the PP introduced spending cuts and tax increases under Rajoy, who was the president, the new president. And then you saw more protests against these cuts, against these tax increases, these austerity measures. And each time there were protests, you had indignados, the 15M protesters, present and involved. Most notably on March 29, 2012, in the Primavera Valenciana, and from May through July 2012 with the Asturian miners' demonstrations that were taking place across the country. Ultimately, it seems that the issues brought to attention by the 15M demonstrations are still very much prevalent in Spain today. And I think you'll continue to see protests in Spain with the same issues in mind of unemployment, of being forced to live with your parents for so long, having a high level of education, investing in yourself, and not being able to find a sustainable employment. These problems haven't gone away. And although 15M brought that to the forefront of the political conversation in Spain, it seems that they were sort of going for a much deeper issue that exists in the country. That seems to be a systematic issue, not just a particular party or ideology issue. So I think you're going to still see the tenets of the 15M movement being relevant in Spain for years to come. Here's just my work cited. Obviously, it was chapter 8 in the text, and the images are all from Google. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. And be safe. Stay home. Stay healthy. Bye.